There is a moment most of us have experienced and experienced more than once. You're sitting in a conversation listening to someone explain something, a concept, a process, a piece of news, and you follow it. You nod, it makes sense. You think, yes, I understand this. Then someone turns to you and says, can you explain that to a friend who wasn't here? And suddenly the words aren't there. The idea, which felt so close a moment ago, starts to blur at the edges. You stumble. You use the wrong analogy. You leave out a critical step. You realize, with quiet alarm, that what you thought was understanding was something else entirely. This isn't a personal failing. It's one of the most consistent and fascinating quirks of human cognition. And today we're going to unpack exactly why it happens, why understanding something is almost always easier than explaining it, and what that gap reveals about the way the mind actually works. We start with the first elimination of the illusion of knowing. Let's start again with a concept that cognitive scientists call the illusion of explanatory depth. In the 1990s, the researchers Leonard Rosenbelt and Frank Kale at Yale ran a simple experiment. They asked people to rate how well they understood every object, things like bicycles, toilets, dippers, and helicopters. Participants rated their understanding confidently. Then the researchers asked those same participants to write out detailed, step-by-step explanations of how those objects actually worked. What happened next was striking. After attempting the explanation, participants dramatically lowered their own confidence ratings. The act of trying to explain revealed gaps they didn't know were there. The bicycle is a classical case. Ask anyone on the street, do you understand how a bicycle works? Almost everyone says yes. Ask them to draw a chain, the pedals, and the frame from memory, specifically how the machines or the mechanics connect to create forward motion, and most people can't do it accurately. They know what a bicycle does, they can ride one, but they don't know how it works at the level that explanation demands. This is the illusion of knowing. Our brains are extraordinarily good at recognizing when something makes sense, and extraordinarily prone to mistaking that feeling of sense-making for genuine mastery. Why? Because understanding and explaining recruit different cognitive processes. Understanding is largely receptive. Your brain receives information, matches it to existing patterns and prior knowledge, fills in gaps automatically using references, and produces a feeling of coherence. That feeling, that sense of I get it, is real and often accurate, but it's also a summary judgment, not a complete map. Explanation is generative. It requires you to reconstruct the idea from scratch, sequence the parts in the right order, anticipate what your listener doesn't yet know, and find language precise enough to carry meaning across the gap between your mind and theirs. That is a fundamentally different and harder task. The curse of knowledge. Now we come to one of the most important and underappreciated concepts in communication. The curse of knowing. Once you know something, it becomes nearly impossible to remember what it was like not to know it. The knowledge colonizes your perspective so completely that you lose access to the cognitive state of ignorance. And that is a profound problem, where when you try to explain something to someone who doesn't share your understanding. Psychologist Elizabeth Newton demonstrated this in a famous 1990 experiment at Stanford. She divided participants into two groups, tappers and listeners. Tappers were given a list of well-known songs and asked to tap out the rhythms on the table. Listeners had to guess the song before the experiment began. Tappers were asked to predict what percentage of songs will the listener correctly identify? The tappers predicted 50%, the actual result about 2.5%. The tappers were stunned that songs felt so obvious to them, because in their heads they could hear the melody, but the listeners heard only a series of disconnected taps. The tappers couldn't unhear the music. That's the curse of knowledge in action. When we try to explain something we understand deeply, we unconsciously skip steps that feel self-evident to us, but are invisible to our audience. We use jargon without defining it. We assume background knowledge that isn't there. We jump from point A to point D because B and C feel too obvious to mention. The expert becomes a poor teacher, not because they know too little, but because they know too much, and they have forgotten the path they took to get there. This is also why beginners sometimes make better teachers for other beginners. They remember the confusion. They haven't yet forgotten what it felt like not to understand. The neuroscience behind the gap. Let us go a level deeper and look at what's actually happening in the brain. When you understand something, when you read a passage, hear an argument, or watch a demonstration, your brain engages in what neuroscientists call predictive processing. Your brain is constantly generating predictions about incoming information, and understanding occurs when those predictions are confirmed or smoothly updated. It's a largely automatic and fast and unconscious process. Explanation is the opposite direction of travel. Instead of receiving and matching information, you must retrieve it, pulling concepts from long-term memory, organizing them into a coherent sequence in working memory, and then encoding them in language that someone else can decode. This engages the prefrontal cortex heavily, the seat of planning, sequencing, and executive function. It's metabolically expensive and cognitively demanding. There is also the matter of language itself. Words are imprecise containers for ideas. When you understand something, your mental model can be rich, spatial, intuitive, and nonverbal. You might understand how a piece of music feels without being able to say it so. You might understand the layout of your neighborhood perfectly, but struggle to give someone directions to them. Language forces you to linearize something that your brain may store in a much more complex, multidimensional form. Translation from thought to word is lossy, and in explanation you are always translating. The tacit knowledge. This brings us to one of the most profound distinctions in the study of knowledge, the difference between explicit knowledge and tacit knowledge. Explicit knowledge is knowledge you can articulate. Facts, procedures, definitions. You can write it down, teach it in a classroom, but put it in a manual. Tacit knowledge in a manual. The tacit knowledge is knowledge you carry in your body, your habits, your intuitions, knowledge you can demonstrate but struggle to verbalize. The philosopher Michael Polanyi, who coined the term, summed it up in one elegant sentence: we know more than we can tell. Think about a master of craftsman, a glass blower who has spent 30 years shaping molten glass knows exactly how much pressure to apply, when the glass is ready, how to read it, its color and viscosity. Ask them to explain it to a beginner. They will try. They will give instructions, but the instructions will inevitably fall short, because much of what they know lives not in their mind, but in their hands, their breath, their muscle memory. It was never stored in language to begin with, so it can't be fully retrieved in language. This applies for far beyond craftsmanship. It applies to social intuition, knowing how to read a room, to professional judgment, knowing when a business decision feels wrong, to athletic skill, knowing how to time a shot. In all these domains, understanding runs far ahead of the ability to explain. The knowledge is real, it's just not verbal. Why this matters? So, any of this is worth spending time with trying to understand and figure out. Because understanding and explaining are different, because this gap has profound consequences in almost every area of human life. In education, it explains why experts often make poor teachers without training in pedagogy. Subject mastery is necessary but not sufficient. The best teachers are those who have developed what researcher Lee Schulman called pedagogical content knowledge. Not just knowing this subject, but knowing how to make it learnable. That is a separate skill. In medicine, it explains why patients so often leave consultations confused. Doctors understand diagnosis with a depth and fluency they can no longer easily translate into plain language. The curse of knowledge closes off the patient's perspective and leadership, for example, and management. It explains why strategies that make perfect sense at the executive level fail to land with frontline teams. The leaders understand the reasoning. They were in the room where it happens. Their employees weren't in relationships. In relationships, it explains countless arguments that spiral not because people disagree, but because one person cannot find the language for what they feel, and the other cannot understand why the explanation is so inadequate. I just can't explain it. It is not a cop-out. It is sometimes a genuine cognitive limitation. And in learning itself, understanding this gap changes how you should study. Simply reading and feeling like you understand is not enough. The most reliable test of whether you truly know something is whether you can explain it clearly to someone else. This is the foundation of the layman technique, named after physicist Richard Feynman, which holds that you don't really understand the concept until you can explain it in plain, simple language without hiding behind jargon. How to bridge the gap. So what do we do with all of this? The gap between understanding and explanation is real, but it isn't fixed. It can be narrowed through practice, through deliberate effort, and through intellectual humility. The first step is to stop mistaking the feeling of understanding for actual mastery. That feeling is a signal worth examining, not simply accepting as yourself. Could I teach this? Could I ask yourself if you could teach this, if you could explain it to a child? Could I answer a skeptic's follow-up question? If the answer is no, your understanding may be shallower than it feels. The second step is to practice explanation. Actively, regularly, find someone who doesn't share your knowledge and try to bring them along. Notice where they got lost, because those are the places where your explanation is failing, and often the places where your understanding is thinner than you realize. Other people's confusion is diagnostic information. The third step is to seek out the tacit. Recognize that some things you know can't be fully verbalized, and that's not a failure. It is the nature of embodied intuitive expertise. Be honest about those limits. Say, I will show you when words genuinely fall short. And the fourth step is to cultivate patience with others and with yourself. When someone struggles to explain something, they clearly feel deeply resist the temptation to fill in their words for them. The struggle is the work, it is how implicit understanding becomes explicit knowledge. It is how knowing transforms into teaching. We live in a world that rewards confidence and explanation. In meetings, in classrooms, on social media, the person who explains fluently is assumed to understand deeply. But as we have seen today, those two things are not the same. The most honest thing any of us can say about our own knowledge is this: I may understand this more than I can explain, and I may explain this more than I actually understand. Both are worth knowing because the gap between them, that uncomfortable, humbling, clarifying space, is exactly where real learning happens. Thank you so much. Tell me what you think in the comments, and tell me if your explanation has gotten any better, or if you have realized according to this that your explanation were insufficient or needed improvement. Looking forward to see you in the next video.